Welcome to our fall 2018 McMillan Stewart talk on women in the developing world. I am Lerna Ekmekçioğlu, McMillan Stewart Chair, based in History and also Women and Gender Studies program, and I organize this lecture series once every semester. The topic is broadly defined as women in the developing world. Mostly developing world has come to mean in this context historically Middle East and North Africa. And today we are very happy and honored to have Professor Amahl Bishara with us. She is a professor of anthropology at Tufts, and her research revolves around topics such as expression, space, media, and settler colonialism. The title of the talk is here, Against Fragmentation, Palestinian Women's Engagements Across the Green Line. I'll give a brief introductory remarks about basically the intellectual biography of Professor Bishara, and then we'll be hearing her, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. Her first monograph is titled Backstories, U.S. News Production and Palestinian Politics, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2013. And it is an ethnography of production of American news during the Second Palestinian Intifada. The central question of the book was the following: what can we learn about journalism and popular political action when we place Palestinian journalists at the center of inquiry about United States journalism? She is a prolific writer, scholar that also engages in what I would call community service maybe, or public scholarship. She has regularly published in Jadaliya, which is an important source for Middle East related news and commentary. Also Middle East Report and Information Project, MERIP. And she also wrote in Cognoscenti, WBUR's blog. She has produced two documentaries, one in 2002 titled Across Oceans and Among Colleagues, and the other in 2010. And the last documentary is titled Degrees of Incarceration, which is an hour-long documentary that explores how a Palestinian community responds to the crisis of political imprisonment with love and creativity. She has also been involved with the production of bilingual Arabic and English children's books about refugee lives, including The Boy and the Wall. She published many articles. I'm just going to mention the last two just to give you an impression of the corpus, let's say. In 2015, one of her articles, the published articles, is titled Driving While Palestinian in Israel and the West Bank, the Politics of Disorientation and the Roots of a Subaltern Knowledge. It's published in American Ethnologist, which I think is related to one of her current book projects. The first one, which is the book that she's working right now, is tentatively titled Permission to Converse, Laws, Bullets, and Other Roadblocks to a Palestinian Exchange, which addresses the relationship between Palestinian citizens in Israel and Palestinians in West Bank, two groups that she claims are positioned slightly differently in relation to Israeli settler colonialism. Through ethnographies of protest as well as more everyday forms of expression, she analyzes the barriers to these two groups speaking to and with each other, arguing that speech is always embodied and emplaced act. Her second ongoing project examines Palestinian popular politics in a West Bank refugee camp. It's about how Palestinians in this particular refugee camp strive to resist three authorities: the Israeli occupation, the Palestinian Authority administration, as well as the United Nations Relief Works Agency, through struggles over land, water, bodies, and expression. You might have recognized that in her titles at least, she doesn't have a lot of focus on women and gender, but they are there. This is one of the ways of doing gender analysis without screaming about it. Both of them are valid. I am one of those people who screams about women and gender, but I also wanted to recognize that sometimes incorporating gender even implicitly might have more influence in the broader field that, especially a contested field like this, that one wants to intervene. But I'm really grateful that she accepted our invitation to do a particular lecture on specifically Palestinian women. And with that, I would like to welcome Professor Bishara.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it's true, this was a great opportunity for me to focus in on women and gender as a lens and as a focus in the research. So I also want to say a big thank you to Lerna for organizing and inviting me to be here today, and also to Women in Gender Studies at MIT, Sophie Hassenfuss, Emily Neal, and to all of you for being here. It's really an honor to present as part of the McMillan Stewart Lecture on Women in the Developing World. Okay, and I love my poster. And, and I will say that the image is by an artist I'm going to be talking about right now named Amahl Bishara, who is my cousin. So that's part of why it's a beautiful poster, but not the whole reason. Anyway, okay, so here's Amahl Bishara in Washington Square Park in New York City, close to where Lerna and I spent many years together, yeah. As she had so many times before, Amahl Bishara donned her eerie curtain of plastic handcuffs and colorful children's toys. On and on it trailed after her. She'd been invited to the United States to share her artwork in galleries and fundraisers, but being here in Washington Square Park and engaging with whoever might come by was as much a part of her mission as anything else. Rana is an Israeli citizen, a woman in her 40s who could attain a US visa with relative facility. She carried the privilege of her own mobility like a cloak, heavy but dear, something that must be shared with the world. She had laboriously assembled these plastic handcuffs to make this long, peculiar cloak. And these plastic handcuffs ties are ubiquitous at demonstrations and checkpoints in Palestine, so much so that Palestinians might as well, indeed, be wearing them, for we and our loved ones are so often caught in their webs. Plastic toys, too, are ubiquitous in Palestine as here, red and yellow and green blocks that entertain children until they're discarded. There's probably another paper to be told here about all the plastic, but I will, noting that the importance of that topic, I'm going to set it aside for today. It's the body caught in the plastic, the flesh at the center of all of this, that holds our attention also. A woman made strange in the city park, slowed down by all that she carries, deliberate in her memory, in this case of so many childhoods lost to Israeli imprisonment. Wherever she travels, this is her mission, to carry these stories of incarceration and loss. Rana is a brave and unusual advocate, both for her passionate artwork and also for so publicly taking on one of the most wrenching and stigmatized aspects of Israeli military occupation, especially doing so as a Palestinian citizen of Israel. I'm going to come back to her work at the end of the talk, or towards the end of the talk, but now I want to back up and give you some of the conceptual scaffolding for it. So Palestinians in Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank are differently ostracized and endangered by the Israeli state. They're divided by what is called the Green Line, which I've helpfully made green here. And they are, Palestinians in Israel are citizens, while those in the West Bank are subjects of military occupation. They're differently impacted by Israeli settler colonialism and its concomitant militarism and racism. Embarking from the idea that expression is always grounded in the place and in the body, so in that sense it is always gendered as well as socialized in other embodied ways, my research is about the different environments for political expression and action of these two groups. I examine what impedes these two groups of Palestinians from speaking to and acting with each other. One of the most basic factors limiting this Palestinian conversation is, of course, the system of checkpoints, walls, and permits that prohibit most Palestinians from the West Bank from entering Israel. And this is just a map of the 490 elements of closure that exist within the West Bank and between the West Bank and Israel. But it's also important to note that it's actually also illegal, though much easier, for Israeli citizens to enter the Palestinian Authority areas of the West Bank. It's illegal, but you can drive right past this sign and nobody is checking your ID. but it does say this road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance is forbidden for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and is against the Israeli law. Okay, the divide between Palestinians in Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank is only one part of a much larger and more complex story of Palestinian fragmentation. Though there have long, of course, been religious, geographic, class, diversities, and hierarchies within Palestinian society, as well as cultural differences and strong senses of regionalism, the primary engine of Palestinian fragmentation over the last 70 years has been Israeli settler colonialism. The events of 1948, what Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, immediately fragmented Palestinians such that they are ruled by several different authorities and assigned different legal statuses. Today, Palestinians hold a number of different legal statuses even under Israeli sovereignty. Some have citizenship, making up 20% of the population of Israeli citizens, Jerusalem temporary residency, a Gaza Palestinian Authority passport, and a West Bank Palestinian Authority passport. And then, of course, outside of historic Palestine, there are many other statuses that refugees carry, whether they're registered with UNRWA or not, and according, of course, to the country that they're in, and beyond the Middle East as well. Each of these groups face some legal and physical barriers to speaking to and with some of the other groups. Although Israel has sought to regard Palestinians in Israel as Arabs or non-Jews, politically active Palestinians in Israel and those in the West Bank have long asserted that they, along with other Palestinians in Gaza and outside of historic Palestine, share a single political struggle for national liberation. And I should say that I can talk to you more about how Gaza is placed in this project as a whole. I won't be talking about Gaza in this paper. And the other thing I can talk about is how, and maybe I'll say this quickly, how Jerusalem is positioned in this paper. Because Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, obviously is part of the West Bank, and it occupied in 1967, and so is legally part of the West Bank under international law. But Israel has annexed East Jerusalem and other parts, areas around East Jerusalem. So effectively, it's treated like it's part of Israel in terms of the closures, preventing people from the West Bank from the rest of the West Bank entering Jerusalem. But back to the question of identity and Palestinian shared identity, the founding declaration of the Al-Ard movement of Palestinians in Israel in 1959 declared, "We are a part of the Palestinian people who are in turn a part of the Arab nation." This language and this steadfast focus on Palestinianness as a political project was echoed in the declarations of the early 2000s as well. We, sons and daughters of the Palestinian Arab people who remained in our homeland despite the Nakba, who were forcibly made a minority in the State of Israel after its establishment, do hereby affirm in this declaration the foundations of our identity. So focusing on identity as a crucial issue here and on Palestinianness in particular. And you can also look at the Future Vision document and Democratic Constitution document from those same years. I have a 10-second clip we can listen to from the Shadia Mansour song, The Kofiya's Arab. Shall we? It's the only audio clip, so you might as well hear it. You can read the lyrics while you do. Okay, so that just to show, obviously, this is part of Palestinian popular culture as well, and all elements of Palestinian culture inside Israel as well. Okay. Sadly, that is all the hip hop that you will hear in this lecture. Okay. While fragmentation is often noted as a key dynamic in contemporary Palestinian politics, in scholarly work, and in art, this fragmentation among different Palestinian groups has not been studied in depth. Sometimes fragmentation almost becomes part of the public conversation, both among Palestinians and outside, but this discussion apparently poses too much of a threat to Israel. In 2017, prominent legal scholars Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley co-authored a UN-commissioned report that asserted that fragmentation is critical to the contemporary political moment. They wrote, and this is in the very top of their paper, "The strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people is the principal method by which Israel imposes an apartheid regime. This fragmentation operates to stabilize the Israeli regime of racial domination over the Palestinians and to weaken the will and capacity of the Palestinian people to mount a unified and effective resistance. Shortly after being issued, this report was rescinded, following pressure from the Trump administration, including accusations that the report was anti-Israel from Nikki Haley. And the person who was responsible for commissioning this report left her job. So you can see that this issue of fragmentation is a big one, as of course is the word apartheid. Okay, so that they dared address Israel and the occupied territories in one report was part of what led to the uproar against this report. Historian Ilan Pape also writes, the frame of occupation, talking about this as an issue of occupation, promotes, quote, a false separation between Israel and the occupied areas and produces the unacceptable dichotomy between democratic Israel and the non-democratic occupied territories, end quote. And I will say that that comes at the beginning of a book that is actually about the occupied territories, right? But he put that in there as a comment about his whole project, right? So what does it mean that Palestine and Israel are seen as two different polities? It's an important thing. I mean, looking up, for example, basic statistics regarding life expectancy and GDP, we see two very different numbers for Israel and what is variously called Palestine, the occupied territories, the Palestinian Authority, or the West Bank and Gaza. According to the West Bank, according to the World Bank, the GDP per capita in the West Bank and Gaza was $3,094 in 2017, while in Israel it was $40,000, more than 10 times. Life expectancy in Israel is 10 years longer in Israel than in the occupied Palestinian territories. So this unnatural separation between these two places, obviously, looking at them as two separate units hides the relationship between them, obviously a relationship of domination. Now, scholars, in addition to people who are writing these UN reports, they are also scholars, but scholars face limits in addressing more than one Palestinian location, even if they recognize the importance of doing this kind of a thing. Even in an era of George Marcus's multi-sided ethnography, this concept of multi-sided ethnography, researchers, we too often allow our work to be delimited by the various state borders that we should instead interrogate. And this is especially true in the Israeli-Palestinian context because obviously we face a lot of limitations on our research that come from the state, as well as sort of from other elements. The problems of doing this work has been the subject of recent anthropological inquiry, as in the book Anthropology's Politics. But there's a lot more to be said about how state politics shape research and writing on Palestinians and also more generally. So my book then will explore several different environments for expression and exchange between and among Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territories. These spaces include spaces of political commemoration, street protest, Facebook, and prison. We can think of each of these as fields in a Bourdieuian sense, where the possibilities for position taking are delimited in relationship to state power and economics, as well as in relationship to the norms of the fields themselves, which Bourdieu reminds us are semi-autonomous. And of course, these are also gendered scenes of action. So in my talk today, I want to discuss the modes of expression and performance that we find in a few different spaces among women traveling to Jerusalem to sell vegetables, in the field of journalism, and related to prison. So gender is the critical element of analysis as I'm exploring fragmentation. Palestinian resistance, of course, occurs within Palestinian culture and its gendered norms. Israeli occupation, too, operates with a gendered logic. Mobility, especially Palestinian mobility across the Green Line, is structured by Israeli assumptions about Palestinian violence and gender. The Israeli occupation regards young men in particular as a threat. Oops, I lost an image. Indeed, it was a common sight, especially during the Second Intifada, to see workers lined up along a wall, detained in the hot sun, and on display as subjects of occupation violence. Women, on the other hand, have some room for maneuver, a common dynamic in colonialisms of the Arab world. Think of that scene in the Battle of Algiers when a French soldier asked a young woman about to deploy a bomb if he might accompany her to the beach, for example. Or how those same French soldiers allowed passage for an older woman walking with a young child. Now let me see. I had images there. There's the young men. And the still from Battle of Algiers. In the West Bank, too, as scholar Rima Hamami has examined, anthropologist Rima Hamami has examined, young women may sometimes be invited to flirt with soldiers as a means of facilitating passage. And women, especially older women, may have their own strategies for negotiating passage, which I'll talk to you more about today. And often, even the very official, it's not just about these one-off interactions, which obviously are also structured by societal norms, but even the official rules about who can cross checkpoints are discriminated by gender and age, such that, for example, sometimes you'll find a rule where women over the age of 40 and men over the age of 65 can enter Jerusalem without a permit. For women, the age is always lower, and for men, it's always higher. And you can read more about this in Yael Berda's excellent new book, Living Emergency. But I also want to underscore that Israeli soldiers also exercise violence against women at checkpoints on the basis of their threats. I'm thinking here of Hadi al-Hashlamon, 18, who was killed at a Hebron checkpoint in December 2015, and also of Isra Jabis of Jerusalem, who was in the process of moving apartments from the West Bank to Jerusalem, from the part of the West Bank into East Jerusalem to maintain her residency, and she was carrying a gas canister and exploded, and near a checkpoint, and Israeli authorities treated it as a terrorist act, and she was very badly burned during that, and is in prison now, and not receiving adequate treatment. Not to say that they cannot be targets of military violence as they're moving or trying to move. So I'm not saying here that women are necessarily more important in their activism across the Green Line. I'm only saying that Palestinians' crossing of the Green Line is certainly gendered in ways that warrant a special look at women's engagement across the Green Line. Another less obvious way in which a feminist lens is an important one on Palestinian politics is that the masculine-dominated modes of thinking about power and statehood have, you might have noticed, led to an impasse in Palestinian politics. Dichotomies between armed resistance and the performance of statehood through modern bureaucracy have each failed to produce a vibrant liberatory politics, let alone actual liberation. Anchored in a liberal U.S. context, Wendy Brown in 1992 wrote the pivotal article, Finding the Man in the State, in which she highlighted 4 modalities of U.S. power that each carry a feature of the state's masculinism, she writes. Juridical legislative, capitalist, prerogative, which means relating to the monopolies, quote, monopolies of internal and external violence in the police and military, end quote, and also the bureaucratic dimension, the state's hierarchicalism, proceduralism, and cult of expertise. And I think we can see that the Palestinian Authority, as this state in the making, would-be state in the making, has certainly attempted to assert its own legitimacy in these modalities, in particular the prerogative and bureaucratic dimensions. In this context, thinking about process and connection, examining what can be built without a change in political structures, thinking about kinds of connections that we can form with each other that might be other than a state-citizen relationship, but might reflect other modes of caring in a feminist modality can be a move inspired by feminist politics. So now to generate how gendered modes of military occupation intersect with gendered elements of Palestinian culture, I want to tell you about women vegetable sellers in Jerusalem. These fellahat, or women from small farms who come from surrounding villages to sell produce, and they come to Jerusalem even though it's quite difficult because they receive higher prices there than they would elsewhere. And this is an old age practice in Jerusalem, as in other Palestinian cities. But in Jerusalem, it's fraught with political tension because, as I mentioned earlier, Israel annexed East Jerusalem and cut it off from the rest of the West Bank. So there's Jerusalem, and the women I interviewed were from Artas, Al-Khadr, Al-Walaja, and Batir, which are all, this map is too small to show it super well, but you can see some of them here on this map as well. Okay. And it's also worth noting that while these villages have strong agricultural traditions, they do not have a lot of arable land that is irrigated. These women instead are farming using traditional, low-water, Baal agriculture techniques that are less profitable, but that still hold an important place in Palestinian foodways. And you can look at the work of Omar Tezdel, for example, to learn more about those kinds of approaches. And so they're not super profitable. When I asked somebody from the Ministry of Agriculture about them, he was like, it was invisible. It was completely invisible. And I should say this is a Google map and that I wrote on. There's an interesting campaign right now because Google Maps actually doesn't work for Palestinians because they don't recognize, because they only recognize roads and not legal systems, and they just don't doesn't work if you're a Palestinian from the West Bank. So there's a petition online you can find about that if you're interested from the Palestinian organization Hamla. This is much more, this gives you a sense of some of the barriers between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, but it's obviously it's hard to read because there's so many of them. Okay. Oh, and I wanted to show you Batir, which is actually a World Heritage Site. This is the kind of, you can see this is not land that's, you plant a big field of something and you harvest it all easily, right? This is small plots of land that you plant with lots of variety, and that's from Batir. Okay. So women who come from these villages to Jerusalem are doubly illegal. First, as people with West Bank papers, they are not allowed to enter Jerusalem without difficult to obtain permits, so they can be stopped by soldiers and turned back or arrested. Second, as people selling vegetables in unlicensed stands, not subject to taxation, they are vulnerable to harassment and fines from Israeli municipal police. So they are illegal, and their produce is too. These women's precarious positions in Jerusalem and their tenacious presence there nonetheless speaks to the tenuous ways in which food traditions and social ties that cross the Green Line persevere despite Israel's attempts to illegalize them. Despite this double illegality, their presence is important to the city. Most visitors to the Muslim quarter of the Old City, the heart of Arab East Jerusalem, will remember these women. They are often wearing traditional red and black embroidered dresses that one can find, that is kind of iconic of Palestinian culture, right? And for Jerusalem Palestinians too, these women signify tradition. As several Palestinians expressed to me, it wouldn't be Jerusalem without these women selling their produce. But of course, I don't want to treat these women as sort of just visual symbols of national heritage. I think the significance of the thob does that work, but it does more than that also. Because it has more significance than that, And then the other thing is that they sell food that's different than what you find in the market. So this is a cauliflower that takes 9 months to grow. Not super profitable because it uses land for so long, right? But this is a specialty. It's a delicacy. It's an old variety that also doesn't need a lot of water. And so this is the kind of some of the kinds of foods that they would sell. In the winter, they also sell they sell ordinary things too. Fava beans, green beans, cauliflower, spinach, a bunch of greens for cooking or salads, things that it's harder to translate into English because they're not big market. They're not even there. They're not necessarily big market holders. Hind basilic. In spring, there are such delicacies as green almonds, chickpeas in the pods, green smoked wheat, frika. And in the summer, things like molokhia. And faqous, another thing, a cross between a cucumber and a squash. So unlike the men selling produce at much larger stands, they do not call out to potential customers. In a way, these women are their own best advertisement because people associate these women with produce grown more naturally on small farms, what people call beledi, produce. And beledi is a complex word that can reference both the local origins but also the traditional process through which these fruits and vegetables are grown. This ba'al, low irrigation agriculture. And if you ask the women about these things, they'll usually tell you the specifics. So for Palestinian buyers from Jerusalem, these women and their vegetables signify Palestinian cultural continuity in several ways. Their dress, their presumed rural lifestyles, and the basic fact that women like these have been coming to Jerusalem from outlying villages to sell their produce for generations. But those who buy from these women may or may not know of the specific travails and tricks that go into these women's access to Jerusalem. They probably do know that it's difficult, but they may not know all the stories. So I want to tell you a few stories about how mobility was engendered across 2 different regimes of public transportation. In the years during and after the Second Intifada, public transportation from Bethlehem to Jerusalem was a network of shared taxis, like 7 or 8 person taxis, that would depart from a central location as they filled, picking up and depositing passengers along the way. This was a time of patchwork public transportation and intense Israeli closure. In January 2004, there were 763 barriers to movement in the West Bank. In 2014, from that slide, there were 490. So it was really intense in an area slightly smaller than the state of Delaware. So all the drivers of these minivans and taxis were men. Some of these shared cabs, especially in Jerusalem's outlying neighborhoods and much of the West Bank, were these ancient 8-seater Mercedes that at once symbolized elegance and indigence. The Mercedes were so old that their maintenance seemed an act of care not only for the cars themselves, but also for the whole fragile, crazy project of moving Palestinians from place to place during those years. Others were newer Ford Transit vans, which the word on the street had been distributed as a kind of payment to Palestinians who collaborated with Israeli police and military authorities. It was said that the vans had been sold and resold, so it wasn't that there was aspersions cast on specific drivers, but there was no doubting the air of indignity surrounding the Fords. They smelled funny, stuffing burst out of punctured upholstery. This all seemed to make the cars stand for a rotten truth about Palestinian politics and society as the Second Intifada wore on and then waned. In some ways, Palestinians were complicit to what was going on. So the view from inside the Fords could be shameful too. Drivers in Jerusalem and Israel could be penalized for harboring illegal passengers in their cars, harshly penalized. And there were also flying checkpoints that could crop up basically anywhere at any time. And so border police would stop cars and collect especially these transits, because they were carrying a lot of people, and collect the identification of drivers and passengers. The driver, if caught with somebody who was traveling illegally, could be subjected to a high fine and even the temporary sequestration of the car. So when shared taxi drivers stop by the side of the road to pick up a new passenger, the passenger hails them, the car stops, and the driver would inquire, "Quds wala Dafa?" Are you from Jerusalem or the West Bank? And if somebody replied that they were from the West Bank, the driver would follow up by asking whether the potential permit whether the potential passenger had a permit. Ma'ak tasrih? They usually didn't actually ask to see the permit. That was like a step too far. But these drivers would forbid West Bankers without permits from riding. So the Ford taxi would swerve back into traffic in search of a safer 2.5 shekels. So this left a lot of people by the roadside, especially young men in work boots and paint-stained pants. But another group of people that was prone to being left by the roadside were these older women in traditional Palestinian embroidered dresses, heaving big bundles of produce behind them. One afternoon back in 2003, the Ford I was in stopped to pick up 2 older women heaving such bags behind them. And the driver looked down at the pair of women and asked if they had Jerusalem IDs. And one of them said, "La ya ami la." No, my uncle, no. But what she really meant was, "No, my nephew, no." And so what she really meant was actually more complicated than this. So to understand this exchange, why an older woman is calling a younger man uncle or nephew, though they don't know each other, we need to know a little bit more about spoken Arabic. Relatives of different generations often refer to each other reciprocally, such that a mother might call her child yamma, mother, or mama, and the child would also respond mama. They call each other mama. I do that too with my daughter. And this is a kind of an address that establishes intimacy between the two figures, even as it maintains, I would say, the hierarchical but reciprocal kinship relationship. So to call your niece uncle is to affectionately remind her of her relationship to you, with its combination of entitlements and obligations. If you want to be playfully upsetting hierarchies, then you call as a mother, you call your daughter sister, yakhti, right? So that's a different thing. But here was an older woman saying ammi to an unrelated young man she just met on the street, who's, again, these guys who are driving these taxis that are kind of sketchy. To do so was to enlist a claim of social obligation, that this kind of a social obligation should be stronger than Israel's permit laws. And it worked. He let her on the bus, and she gave him her 2.5 shekels. It wasn't the only time that a driver had broken his own rules and allowed a West Banker, as they are called, into his car. But they did more often break the rules for older women than for young men. Still, though, it was notable that her culturally sanctioned performance of relationality there had worked. These evocations of social relationship disrupt the norms of relationality in what Elizabeth Povinelli has called the liberal diaspora. And more specifically, they disrupt Israeli policies that impose fracture upon Palestinians. In her book, Empire of Love, Elizabeth Povinelli talks about the intense sociality of Aboriginal Australians who extend kinship terms well beyond the bounds of nuclear families. In both the Palestinian case and the Aboriginal case, there is danger involved with these forms of social connection. She writes, I'm drawing on a quote of hers, where she talks about the high levels of poverty and the bad healthcare system means that being too social puts you literally at the risk of illnesses, like skin infections, right? But it's worth it. She writes, Povinelli writes, quote, in perhaps the most damning social analysis of settler society, indigenous men and women from the Northwest Coast observe how comfortable white people are living at home, how they seem satisfied by the thinnest embrace of the conjugal couple, how they would rather be alone than have one little louse. And she calls the Aboriginal alternative thick life. Now, Palestinians have something of this thick life in communities on either side of the Green Line, but they don't necessarily have a thick life that bridges the Green Line in general, right? Because it's quite dangerous. So when a woman invoked kinship terms to claim a seat on the cab, this involved invoking a Palestinian norm of a socially thick life that would transverse the Green Line. It was as though she asserted, my reference to you as my nephew may not reflect things as they are, but this is how they should be. In later years, a more formal bus system was reestablished. On these full-size buses, drivers are not responsible for their passengers' papers and permits, but they are still all men as far as I've ever experienced. Under this regime, all buses from Bethlehem to Jerusalem now stop at a checkpoint on the way, and everybody's papers are checked. But people still expect that when buses are going back from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, they won't be checked, okay? So once I was on a bus in 2009 going from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and that bus was pulled over by soldiers at a flying checkpoint. The soldiers gathered everyone's IDs, detained several of the young men who did not have those permits, and in front of me sat an old woman who impassively told the soldier that she had not brought her ID. The young soldier admonished her. You know you have to bring it everywhere you go. She promised, next time I will. And she just performed not knowing the rules, being just an old lady who'd forgotten her ID, and they allowed her to pass. Another time I heard a woman vegetable seller told me that she had once faked being asleep when soldiers boarded the bus and they just overlooked her. And this was a strategy that certainly would not work for young men. Some women vegetable sellers evade the public transportation system altogether. One woman, Samar, a farmer from the village of El Khadr near Bethlehem, explained to me, the road is difficult. We leave sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes even earlier, to get to Jerusalem. We walk far, almost as far as from here to Bethlehem. She explained that they might hire a taxi to take them part of the way and then walk through these narrow streets and paths and eventually through a hole in the fence. And she described the injuries and indignities of these kinds of journeys. But again, once in a while when people are caught, when these women are caught, they have no choice, but they decide to, they talk back to the soldiers in ways that, in surprising ways, sometimes work, right? A woman was still on the West Bank side of the Green Line when she was stopped by a soldier, and he wanted to take away her shoes. And she said, if you do that, I'll sue you because I'm diabetic. When he threatened to take her phone, he proclaimed, I'll die before I give you my phone. So these strong stances are really part of a gendered mode of performing opposition to the occupation that you see in many different places. There's obviously a very strong tradition of this, especially during the First Intifada, which has been written about, but it's a tradition that goes beyond that as well. But it wasn't only women from the West Bank who used their savvy to negotiate passage into Jerusalem. It was also women from Israel who asserted their rights to travel in the West Bank. So, as you heard in my first book, I studied the production of U.S. news about Palestinians and highlighted the role of Palestinian journalists in producing U.S. news. I was surprised in my research by the existence of a cadre of Palestinian women journalists who carried Israeli citizenship. A journalist I call Palestine particularly stoked my curiosity and won my admiration. Now, her family lived in the Galilee and in Haifa, but she had decided to move to Jerusalem. And again, her decision to leave home actually does fit a gendered cultural pattern, though it's a very unusual one. So most women move out when they become married. She, at a certain point, decided that she wasn't going to get married anytime soon, so she moved out anyway to establish another kind of adult life. Whereas if you're a man who's not getting married, you still stay home, because you're preparing to establish your home there. There's no expectation that you're going to leave. Now, obviously not all women who decide not to get married leave the house, but this is a cultural pattern I've found. And it was also clear to me from Palestine's home that her move to Jerusalem was part of a strong identification with her Palestinian identity. It was a beautiful, old Palestinian home she was renting with limestone walls this thick, cool in the summer, warm in the winter, smooth and solid all year long. Arches marked the passageways between the rooms, and a dome lifted attention skyward. She had a lot of, Palestinian cultural heritage basically in every room all around her. And many of these, I think, she must have brought from her many travels around the West Bank. Her presence as a Palestinian from Galilee in Jerusalem was itself a political statement. Only a handful of journalists and NGO activists routinely traversed the multiple political and physical barriers that isolated these various Palestinian communities from each other. And so for her, she relished her travels because, again, kind of like Rana at the beginning of the paper, she knew that it was a privilege. It was also a risk and a constraint. It was not always comfortable, but she knew it was a privilege, right? Being connected, being able to listen to so many different Palestinian stories in a way that spanned the Green Line, even if she wasn't able to write them up as she wanted to with her byline, was because she was working with foreign journalists, was itself a political accomplishment in this time of widespread closure. And it continues to be one today. So I saw Palestine deploy her gendered powers of negotiating movement at a checkpoint as she was working as a journalist. She covered many, many stories about the wall. And it seemed that she just knew basically everybody living next to the wall for like several towns. Like that's the way it seemed to me when I would drive around with her. So she arranged one time to go to a press conference in the village of Beit Surik, and she'd gotten a bunch of journalists to come with her. She was a fast-talking, trilingual field producer, as dynamic in English as she was in Arabic and Hebrew. And so we met at the American Colony, which is a hotel and restaurant that served as the elegant hub of so many foreign correspondents and wealthy Palestinians' social lives in East Jerusalem. As we embarked, I couldn't help but notice that Palestine had more energy than most of the journalists she was leading. And also that some of the foreign correspondents were along for the ride. They were happy to be there, but she was the one with the true energy. So Israeli soldiers stopped the first part of our four-car caravan at a roadblock outside of Beit Iksa, which was one village away from Beit Surik. Soldiers asked to see our ID cards and press passes, and they tentatively let us pass, even though we didn't all have press passes. But as we were waiting for the remainder of cars to arrive, a police car swung around in front of us, and the soldiers announced that we could not pass because we're heading into a closed military area, which they had put up in order to prevent people from going to this demonstration, which is a normal mode of undermining demonstrations. So she did a lot of negotiations. She called military authorities on the phone. She encouraged other journalists who were stopped there to do the same. She got the soldier to show and really hold up for photography the military order declaring that this had all of a sudden been declared a closed military area. But we never got through. So here she used this verbal performance. She made a little event, even though we didn't get to the actual event. But it was still an effective verbal performance, even if it didn't get us through. It was effective in other ways. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about my last sort of set of examples around imprisonment. Gendered mobility in relationship to prison is another modality that I'm exploring in this book and in this project. In this case, too, women's responsibility to keep people in touch with one another is related to both how sociality is gendered in Palestinian society and how Israeli rule operates. So just to give you a sense of the numbers regarding political prisoners, in July 2018, out of 5,820 political prisoners, only 70 were from inside Israel. Out of 5,800, 401 were from East Jerusalem, and 63 were women. Okay? So, of course, prison operates by isolating people. an extreme example of the kind of fragmentation I've been describing. So how can prisoners and their families maintain socialities? I spoke to a former long-term prisoner, Mukhlis Burgal of Al-Lid, a Palestinian city inside Israel, this summer. And he explained to me, quote, "The human, in order to truly live his humanity, must be social. So when they put you in isolation, this is very difficult. They make you lose one of the most important parts of your humanity." Families of prisoners, especially those from inside Israel, thus made connections with each other that challenged the Green Line. As Burgal recalled, families meet together in the visits. People create friendships. Until today, there are families from Gaza that my mom knows from visits, and every once in a while they reach out to her. So my mother used to say, "Bifadl Mukhlis, thanks to Mukhlis, I have hundreds of children." And they came from all over historic Palestine. Also, prisoners who are released under agreements with authorities, like before they finish their sentences, are usually released with restrictions, including restrictions on movement. So prisoners from inside Israel are not allowed to go to the West Bank, and prisoners from the West Bank are not allowed to go to Israel. Like they're not even allowed to apply for permits, and if they do, they'll get their original sentence reinstated, which can be like a very long sentence. So crossing the, metaphorically crossing the Green Line while in prison shaped the friendship of Khalid al-Azraq, a former long-term prisoner from Aida refugee camp, who is my brother-in-law, and Karim Yunus, who is the longest-serving political prisoner who happens to be from the village of Ara in Israel. During their long years of shared imprisonment, Khalid and Karim became very close, and their families did as well. It is one of the most wrenching elements of a release that one inevitably leaves behind others who deserve freedom. But Khalid, released in 2013, cannot even apply for a permit to visit Karim Yunus's family, nor can Khalid's family easily visit Karim's family due to the permit regime. But Karim's mother and sister have visited Khalid's family many times, both before and after Khalid's release. Earlier this year, Khalid had twin babies, and he named one of them Karim. And so the mother and sister brimmed with pride to visit again and meet the baby named after their imprisoned son and brother. And over the summer, Karim's sister tried to arrange a visit for kids in Aida camp to go to the beach. So they're crossing the Green Line with some difficulty, and they're also hoping to help other people kids cross the Green Line with permits to go to the beach for fun, for Eid. Okay, and finally we return to the story of Rana Bishara. Palestinian citizens of Israel engage in activism on behalf of prisoners, but it's not one of the biggest issues, but it's there, right? Whether by organizing protests or by, in recent years, attending to prisoners on hunger strikes that are held in hospitals in Israel. So I want to return now to the work of Rana, who is an activist and artist who has boldly nurtured prisoners during their trials, during hunger strikes, and throughout their sentences. And this activism has, in turn, fed both her public art and her gallery exhibitions. Rana grew up in the Galilee town of Tarshiha, which I've marked at the very top there. And I'm using her real and full name because I want to highlight her work as an artist, of course. Rana went to college in Haifa. She did a Fulbright in the United States, and she stayed a few years here. But other than that, Tarshiha was her home base until about 13 years ago when she decided to move to Beit Jala, which is next to Bethlehem. Like Palestine, she established a home that celebrates Palestinian culture, adorned with embroidery and other Palestinian textiles, and most of all, full of her artwork, which focuses heavily on Palestinian materials, as you'll see. So she also taught art. In 2009-2010, she had a student who was the wife of a prisoner. And this woman had tensions with her husband's family when she refused to be strip searched during a visit to prison. But she suffered deeply during their separation. So she began an art project of a 100-meter-long letter to her husband. The project attracted some outside attention, which turned out to be too much for her husband's family. They asked her to stop, but she was insistent on continuing, and Rana helped her continue. This experience was one catalyst for Rana doing more activist and artistic work on prisoners. I do think that, honestly, the prisoner issue is one that is at the center of the issue, and yet is often overlooked because it's not, one of the three top negotiating concerns, refugees, Jerusalem, and, borders of a future Palestinian state, right? So it's a deeply humane issue, and yet it's also obviously fraught because it brings one closer to, questions around Palestinians' use of violence. So when Shadi Farah was arrested in December 2015 at age 13, he was one of the youngest political prisoners. He comes from the village of Kufr Aqab, which is actually in the part of the West Bank that was annexed by Israel, but it's on the West Bank side of the wall. And he and his cousin were arrested for carrying a knife with the intention of using it against soldiers near the Jerusalem light rail, though they never used it or even actually pulled it out of their bags. Still, this was a season when a lot of people were receiving high sentences, so he and his family, fearing a harsh sentence, accepted a plea deal after he had already spent months in prison. That's, of course, how plea deals work here as well, right? It involved additional 2-year sentence at a youth detention and rehabilitation facility, Al Marsa, in the Galilee. Because this is not a usual prison, it's more difficult to access. And it was very difficult for his mother to go there and visit him. It was about $200 a trip. So Rana, who had actually attended many of Shadi's court hearings and established a strong relationship with the family, and especially Shadi's mother, herself visits Shadi often. She speaks of how clever he is, how determined he is to persevere, and also, of course, of his youth. And she commented that the intimacy of her activism, visiting prisoners, meeting with families of prisoners, quote, makes you feel like these prisoners are your sons and daughters. She also recognizes how lucky she is to be doing this work. And lucky is her word. These relationships have inspired her artwork on behalf of child prisoners, including an abacus made of barbed wire, which, as you can see, she uses also as a motivation for attracting attention during public events. Like it's a part of public demonstrations. It has wheels on the bottom, as you can see. A giant ball made of barbed wire and a curtain made of plastic ties like those used with the handcuffs. And the ball and the curtain are both woven through with toys. These art pieces suggest how the violence of occupation intrudes upon all aspects of childhood. In her performance with the barbed wire ball, she demonstrates the entangling quality of the occupation, how difficult it is to escape the barbs of military rule. She's also made a birthday cake as an art piece for the prisoner Ahmed Manasra, who is a well-known young prisoner who also turned 14 while in prison. And for Shadi, the other prisoner that I just mentioned, she sang for him outside. She sang a birthday song for him outside of court. So the cake here, you can see, is in a chocolate color that doubles as the brown of chocolate, but also the brown of prison uniforms in Israel. And you can see that it's adorned with barbed wire. Ahmed's name is written in a sweet Arabic cursive, but the stamp of the prison authority uniforms is in Hebrew block print. Prison claims the most basic moments of passage for too many Palestinian children, she's saying. Here, art imitates life. Again, because, as I mentioned, she actually sang a happy birthday song for Shadi outside of a prison during one of his court cases, or outside of the court during one of his court dates. Another element of her prison-related activism has been perhaps even more wrenching. This is another one of her pieces, which she considers a kind of a self-portrait, so I thought I might as well put a new version of her up for this last slide. She has befriended and accompanied prisoners on hunger strikes. These prisoners have engaged in individual hunger strikes over the last several years, especially to protest administrative detention, which is Israel's policy of detaining people without charge for 3-month renewable terms. Mohammed Al-Qiq is a journalist from Hebron who works for a Saudi news agency and was a student leader at Birzeit University. And he has a master's in comparative Arab studies from Birzeit University. In 2016, he was on a hunger strike for 94 days in both the Ramla prison inside Israel and then later in Afula hospital, also inside Israel. He literally lost the ability to speak, but gained from the strike the ability to make a statement that many around the world heard against Israel's policy of administrative detention. Now, there were many checkpoints in the hospital blocking access to the prisoners on the hunger strike, but Rena and others who were involved in the demonstration on his behalf actually managed to sneak in and see him once. On other occasions, after he moved to the hospital and there were complicated legal procedures, he was allowed to receive some visitors, and Rena visited him as much as she could. She gave him a picture she made of the Hanun poppy plant to give him hope and energy for victory, which he held dear and posted later on social media when he was released. Trust and friendship take strange shapes when one is on a hunger strike in prison. When he was drinking only water and worried that authorities would give him nutrients in the water, he trusted only Rana to refill his water bottle. His wife, Vayhashalah, was a very active and very, very effective spokesperson on his behalf, but she was unable to visit him because Israel would not give her a permit. So Rana was a steady presence those days and a conduit to Fayha. And you can imagine that, because she was coming and going back to Beit Jala, there were other activists from other parts of the Galilee there, but she was the one who was going back and forth to the West Bank. And that along with, other factors, including being a woman, were what made it easier for her to be a connection to Fayha. And Rana has made artwork for and about individuals on prisoners on hunger strike as well. See, this is him on a hunger strike. Okay, so for example, and these are social media posts as well as artworks. So, pieces of advocacy as well. She's carved the face of Samra Isawi onto a piece of cactus. And of course, the sabr is a symbol of perseverance and strength. Its potential dryness, its endurance, its relationship to the land are all incredibly powerful characteristics for expressing Palestinian suffering on hunger strikes. And also, obviously, steadfastness. The Palestinian value of steadfastness is, epitomized, obviously, in a hunger strike. And as you can see, Rena's work, whether with barbed wire or cactus, puts her in touch with dangerous materials. She can't help but hurt herself while she's doing this work. Just like I can't imagine that she's sitting next to, people who are more or less, starving to death without hurting herself as well. And yet, these are materials that necessarily wound her, but she's making of them, she's working with them in acts of creation. I, in fact, found it difficult to really get in the moment to write about them because even though I actually am not, I'm relatively, I think about prisoners and I write about prisoners and, interact with prisoners, former prisoners, but I couldn't imagine really what she was doing. Writing about this was a different thing to think about the work that she had done and putting herself in such proximity to the prisoners. The pain of the prisoners and of drawing close to them is a gift, but one that rends one's own body, and this is evident in her work. I will say, so this is really truly an act of nurturing and caring. The other thing she does is she embraces the possibility of unlikely change and also of some weirdness or strangeness, right? So this is a portrait of a prisoner on cactus that completely dried out, and yet still, as she always delights in, the cactus grew another leaf. That's what these cactuses do. She has a bunch of cactus projects, and the miraculous and wonderful thing about them is all of a sudden they're growing again. And it's a true gift, as you can imagine. So in short, Rena's activism is a testament to the possibility of non-biological kinship as a pillar of strength under occupation. And her artwork is an extension and expression of this kinship that can be seen on Facebook, in galleries, in parks the world over, challenging the dynamics of Palestinian fragmentation. And this is true also of the families who make connections across the Green Line. They create these radical new forms of relationality that challenge fragmentation and the isolation of prison. So in conclusion, one primary mode of Israeli repression is control of movement, not only within the occupied territories, but also between Israel and the occupied territories. This affects political and cultural life across a wide range of contexts, including for vegetable sellers, journalists, artists, and activists. Mobility is highly gendered, as it is, I think everywhere, but especially for Palestinian society, due to the policies and practices of Israeli occupiers. Looking at a wide range of activities, some more obviously political than others, but all of vital importance in this moment where sustaining Palestinian lives is so dear, we can see that women make the most of the mobility to produce knowledge, to sustain cultural practices, to nurture, to express sympathy and solidarity, and to create something new. At this critical juncture for Palestinians, when the official leadership is so devoid of vision and so directionless, this may be an especially important time to examine how Palestinians maintain connection, how they cherish their cultural heritage, how they nurture each other through the worst moments of Israeli occupation violence. A feminist approach to politics can decenter our assumptions about what politics are and refocus our attention on process and on, radical and new forms of kinship, I hope as well, on cultivating a ground for liberation. Thank you. Oh. Perfect. Yeah, of course.
Yes, the floor is open for questions.
Hi.
First of all, riveting talk, and thank you so much for being here and giving that talk. I have a sort of question about resistance to apartheid and colonialism in Israel in sort of two parts. The first in terms of what's happening in Palestine, because just yesterday I heard about Khan al-Amr is, the sewage is being dumped into it, and they were meant to evacuate, and they're sort of holding firm, but on the other hand, Angela Merkel said that she might not go if they're made to evacuate and so on, and I think that shows something about how Israel is perceived in the international community now. And at the same time, we have these demonstrations in Gaza that have been going on at the border. And I wonder if you believe that there is a new phase of resistance in Palestine and where it's going, particularly with Ahmed Tamimi. And also the other part is in terms of the international solidarity movement, because your talk to me was especially breath of fresh air in an institution which is so thoroughly ensconced in Zionism and connections with Israel. We have exchange programs here, and Birthright is advertised, and entrepreneurships and all these things. And I think in this context, the boycott is very, very important. And I was wondering if you could speak as well about support for the boycott of Israel and how to make that a standard practice of, resistance to apartheid and genocide.
Well, so we'll see. I think in terms of whether or not this is a new moment, I think thank you for your question. I think we will see if it is we will see where things go. I was very encouraged that there were now demonstrations across the Green Line in Israel and the occupied territories against the new nation state law. So that was really inspiring and powerful. I think it's really important to note how the Gaza March of Return, the Gaza March of Return is actually called a March of Return. The March of Return is also an annual procession organized by Palestinians inside Israel, in which they return on Nakba Day to a village that was depopulated in 1948. It's a really powerful thing because obviously they are the people who have the, again, mobility privileges to be able to be on those lands. And so that's a really important thing, and it's very interesting to see that language of return being used in different places. I have seen more interactions across the Green Line surrounding some of these movements. Solidarity between Haifa and Gaza we saw, and also some less in the West Bank, but a little bit of Palestinians in the West Bank working to support both the protests in Gaza and also activities inside Israel. Boycott is a really important tactic, in particular because it asks for three important things: the end of occupation, the right of Palestinian refugees to return, and the equality for equality within Israel. And so I think in its very essence, it has actually it's an important mode of fighting against fragmentation, because it reconstitutes Palestinians as a collective that shares a set of concerns, shared concerns.
So there were about a minimum of 250,000 Palestinians were removed by Kuwait. What was all that about? Why were they removed?
You know what? I have to say that was really not part of my talk. So I am not, unfortunately, a historian with an expertise in that subject, so I'm sorry I can't answer that.
Well, maybe it's something you should look into. I'd love to know the answer to that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a rich talk. My question about Palestinians inside Israel who actually take advantage of the mobility, the language fluency in Hebrew, etc. How much they actually can affect the Israeli society, the Jewish Israeli society, and if there is any particular network they are engaged in with other Israeli activists who also could be concerned about humanitarian conditions inside West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah, so some of the most exciting activism going on these days is also, through organizations like Zochrot and other organizations that are maybe predominantly Jewish Israeli, but also have some Palestinians in them, as Zochrot, works closely with Palestinians, and other, Jewish Israeli organizations that are doing this kind of activism. Palestinians in Israel, I think in that little Shadia Mansour thing, piece, she talks about sort of being part of two worlds, and I think that Palestinian citizens of Israel do. It's very interesting because on one hand they articulate more about their identity, partly because their identity is more threatened on a cultural level, right? So they're more, that's where you hear this Ana Palestiniya, this kind of a language, perhaps even more than in the occupied territories. But and I can't speak so well as to the diaspora, where obviously Palestinian identity is contested in many different ways that are more complicated and stigmatized in certain cases, right? But I think speaking Hebrew is an important tool. I think that who speaks Hebrew now in the occupied territories? Prisoners, if they've been in prison a long time, people, especially men over like 45. Because there's been 20 years of closure, right? So people who are working in Israel and had learned Hebrew inside, and I think that there's a recognition that speaking Hebrew would be a good thing, but there's not a lot of, it's not a priority, and some people don't want to bother with it at all, right? So certainly Palestinian citizens of Israel who speak Hebrew can be certain kinds of brokers. There are tensions around that, absolutely. For Palestinian citizens of Israel who go into the West Bank, and they in public spaces they probably are careful about not speaking Hebrew. You know what I mean? Or even having a word slipped in. Do you know what I mean? Because it's not, it's fraught, obviously. So the language is a resource as well as a, something to be aware of and careful about. I don't know if I totally answered your question around activism.
This kind of network with Israeli activists. The Israeli society is shifting way far right. So to what extent actually Palestinian activists inside Israel they can sort of make a dent in this?
I don't think that it's Palestinian activists who are going to make a dent in the Israeli public sphere, right? They're very marginalized. Thinking of a book by D. Schechter, I'm forgetting his first name. But anyway, they've been marginalized for a long time, right? But yes, they're being more and more marginalized. I don't think that the people who are going to convince mainstream Jewish Israelis, as that mainstream is drifting right, to come on back over are going to be Palestinian citizens of Israel. Except, you do see sometimes popular culture that has some Palestinians in it. I'm not an expert on those kinds of things, but I wonder, maybe that opens up new possibilities. But I don't see that as the pressure point, unfortunately, right? It's an interesting question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I remember when the green line was drawn, it was in some UN resolution.
Armistice. No, it was an armistice line after the war. It's 48. Yeah, 49.
So since then, there have been so much settlement expansion.
Uh-huh.
And so basically it's like kind of, I don't know, de facto it's undefined. Like the situation on the ground, like the borders that you've drawn, like Israel is obviously way more expanded into the West Bank beyond that. And so I'm curious why you focused your research, or actually situation on the ground. I don't know if there are like specific borders or checkpoints around the Green Line, or how the dynamic has changed because of the settlements, and like, so to like two questions, like why did you decide to focus your research on the Green Line specifically as opposed to, I guess, the situation on the ground, the dynamics of movements of the Palestinian women going in, and whether they go into the settlements to sell their vegetables, and also, I forgot the second part of the question. But
Maybe I'll remember.
Yeah, like how does it affect the dynamics of movement, and why was it your choice of research?
So, I mean, in some ways, using the word the Green Line is a quick way of saying I'm interested in the relationship between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank, which is a handful to put in a title, right? So the Green Line is what seems to divide them, but as you point out, Israel has had these policies of erasing the Green Line for decades, right? With bypass roads, with settlements, and so forth, right? So, I mean, if you are a Jewish Israeli, and I have a friend or colleague Callie Madoff, who writes about sort of the erasure of the Green Line, that there are settlers in the West Bank who are basically kind of, who it's of no importance to them, right? You know, they feel that completely that they're inside Israel, right? Even the wall can become invisible, which is amazing. For Palestinians, they are aware of where the Green Line is because Palestinians in the occupied territories cannot enter Israel without permits that are very, very difficult to obtain, right? And Palestinian citizens of Israel who are aware of sort of the, you know, like I said, they can cross by that red sign that I posted, but it's illegal. They can do it. Some people do it, many people do it, but they know they're doing something illegal, and it probably is in the back of their minds, right? So the Green Line, while it's been erased in those ways, as you point out, it's still an important political and legal barrier between two groups, right? And useful to explore. Yes, checkpoints, many checkpoints do exist on the Green Line itself or very close to it, often near the wall. And you can look on the UN. I think the red X's are checkpoints. So you can see that, and the green ones. See, the green ones are the Green Line ones. And the red ones are very close to the Green Line. Or sorry, some of these are very close to the Green Line. It's not on the Green Line, but it's very, very close, right? And then these are, you can tell, are other checkpoints, I'm pretty sure, that are inside. I'm remembering the key, but that makes sense from what I know of where checkpoints have been.
So what are the checkpoints to go from where to where?
They're not really, they're checkpoints, people go, goods and people pass through them with permits. This is a UN map produced by the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as you can see.
So I have questions about those ladies who have been transporting produce goods, and you made it very, very clear that it's not profitable. But then I'm assuming for those ladies it might be profitable, but then if not, what do you think drives them to go back and forth? And I see that it's a generation of practice, but then I don't know if that alone really will explain their drive to, you know, sneak in and like go in. And I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So what I should say, it's not profitable to sort of on a Palestinian national, you know, GDP kind of level. It's not going to make a dent, right? And it's not. But for these women who have small plots of land, and that's all that they have to sell, they can either sell, if they sell it in Bethlehem, they're not going to get that much for it. If they sell it in Jerusalem, they'll get more for it. So it's profitable to them. It's just not legible to sort of what is the quasi-national economy information. Yeah, I'm sorry if I was unclear about that. Yeah.
And does it usually take multiple days for them to get to?
No, it's one day. It's very short. I mean, these distances are extremely short. But they sometimes sleep inside Jerusalem and then just have vegetables or other produce sent back after them. You know, they will they'll sleep in Jerusalem and have stuff sent after them so they can sell more than one day's worth of stuff. They do that sometimes. Yeah, or sometimes they have a permit for one reason or another, and then they can come and go. Fridays you can go if you're over a certain age to go pray. You know, so people take advantage of various loopholes and possibilities. Yeah.
I wonder what are the social dynamics between people who have the freedom of mobility and who don't. Is it like a status symbol? Is it some class issues? There's some envy or like blaming them of being like traitors who go to enemy side or something? Like, what is the relationship between these two categories of people?
Oh, as a person who has movement privileges, I can talk to you about the discomforts of all of that, right? Yeah, I mean, I think there are there's a lot of tension around it. I mean, I have written papers about this, and I will write even more, right? So, for example, I once did a project where there was a group of photographers in Jaffa in Israel coming to the West Bank to meet with a group of photographers, and there was an exchange between them. And part of the deal was that they were supposed to meet each other and go to each other's places, and that would be fun and interesting and good, but and Palestinians in both locations. And when I wrote the grant, the situation looked kind of stable, and I thought that I was going to be able to get maybe permits for the youth, or that perhaps it would be so stable that they would just go in illegally. But it happened during 2014, which was right before, it was the summer of 2014. The lead up to the Gaza war then was very, very tense for months. And they were not getting permits, and nobody was going to go in illegally because it would be a huge risk. And so the people from Jaffa could come to Bethlehem, but not the reverse, okay? And even that was a little bit tense for people. And there was a little bit of a we're very happy to host you as people in the Bethlehem side. We're very happy to host. They were, of course, disappointed that they couldn't go to Jaffa. It's a beautiful city. It's the beach, blah, blah, blah. And, they were disappointed. But so it was extra tension and laden, it was just laden with tension, this meeting, because of the fact that one group had mobility and the other didn't. Within the West Bank, sometimes people who have permits are regarded as, oh, what'd you do for that? Do you know what I mean? Like, or you must not be good politically because, that they could be collaborators, or if you've got somebody who has been in prison, you don't get permits at all. So somebody could be like, I never get permits, and that's sort of a mark of their nationalism, right? On the other hand, there's an understanding that, some people, there's a total understanding that some people, need a job in a settlement, which also requires a permit, or in Israel to work. And so they're going to be super careful about, various things so that they get a permit, right? So people understand the exigencies of needing a permit, using a permit. But, honestly, like when I'm in the West Bank, I don't go to the beach for the day because it's really weird. And I'm not going to come back, unless I'm going, with people who are from the West Bank. I just don't. You know what I mean? So it is tense and it's weird, and yeah, that'll continue. Yeah. I was just watching today a movie about the pass system in South Africa, which it was different, but this is obviously a big-time colonial tactic of controlling mobility that we can see across places. And it's a great question to explore. Yeah. Jeremy.
Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
So two questions. You don't need to answer both because I see we have not a lot of time left. But one is just an invitation to comment on ethnography as your method and on like the kinds of I'm thinking about as a man, the kinds of relationships I'm able to work with in Palestinian society are different. And so just like the kinds of against fragmentation and connection building you're able to track ethnographically, and how that would compare to other ways people might study, this like cataloging checkpoints as a method. And another invitation would be to just talk more about the distinction you were drawing between these forms of politics you're talking about, like building connections, non-biological forms of kinship, which I think you alluded to as a feminist sort of, or having feminist kind of orientation, in relation to the politics of the Palestinian Authority and the focus on state building, maybe also the kind of like the fragmentation that comes with neoliberalization and people getting more interested in, buying a house and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the first question on ethnography, I'm deeply grateful for people like Yael Berda who are doing kind of the legal and, she's a legal sociologist who's written a new book called Living Emergency, which I referenced in the talk, around the permit system. And, Amira Haas has written about, many people have written about this, and it's very important to catalog all of that, and I draw on that all the time. Yeah, I do think the lived experience of mobility is really, really interesting. I will say that, my position right now, I'm like, speaking of thick life, like I currently have 2 extended families there, right? You know what I mean? As well as friends and work commitments. So like, I'm really living the thick life, down to the lice sometimes, right? You know what I mean? So the point is that, and that's obviously extremely rich, a little bit constraining. And so it means that I'm not doing, I think even if I was an ethnographer doing, if I was an ethnographer new to the field, I would have a very different mode of studying this than I do now, right? Because now I have really strong relationships in a few different communities. And so I know what people say about behind people's backs around, or what people whisper or say. I know how people even look at me when I'm traveling around in my rented car. I actually have a documentary that deals with this. It's called "Take My Pictures for Me," and it's quite different, right? If I were new, it would be really interesting to maybe find other kinds of social activity that are happening across the green line that I don't get a chance to access because again, my life is so thick there, right? That I'm so committed, right? As a woman, I think my mobility is a little bit affected by being a woman there. But again, I already have an Israeli and a U.S. passport, so I'm pretty secure anyway. Also, I'm now middle-aged, and I often travel with children, which helps. All these elements of my personality or my presentation help a lot. You know what I mean? Again, on the other hand, I'm related to people who don't have those privileges, closely related, and so I know very much what that's about, and it affects me directly. In terms of the second question around, I think I would like to develop and think more about this, because I think that, what do we have as an alternative to thinking about connections and modalities of care and nurturing that will create another kind of a politics? I really think, one important goal of anthropology, whether it's ethnographic or not, is to think about politics outside the box that politics is usually put into, outside of this frame of state politics, right? So when Wendy Brown writes about the finding the man in the state, I want to think about politics beyond those institutions, because really we need, obviously, alternative forms of doing and thinking politics. And I don't want to essentialize what feminine forms of politics are, or feminine values of doing politics are, but I can speak from my field experiences where, men are nurturing too in Palestine, right, as here, right? But I do think that, there's no, when I listen to Rena talking about what it meant for her to be connected to, a 12-year-old, 13-year-old boy, is clearly there's a kinship relationship that's being developed. It's very rich. And when I hear about her sitting next to a man who's so emaciated and so cut off from his social network, she told me, she was often the only woman in the room, and that did make a difference, And obviously, we know that you can approach those settings as settings of care or as settings of rah-rah politics or whatever else. So I do think that highlighting modalities of care and connection can be an interesting way of thinking, and I would actually really welcome ways of thinking more deeply about that in relationship to a lens of gender and sexuality and other modes of thinking about kinship. Yeah, because it's not my super strength at all. Jude, yeah?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For the richness of your presentation. And it's not exactly a question, but I'm struck by the commonalities between how a hostile state imprisons people here also, and the kind of fragmentation that it causes where formerly incarcerated folks can't visit the people that they were incarcerated with, and have such restrictions on their mobility because of still being under the control of the state post-incarceration because of being on probation or being on parole, and the restrictions of that, and the ways in which solidarity and kinship and the kind of commitment that I know mainly with sisters, but who come out, the commitment they have to the women they leave behind is profound.
Yeah.
Similar to what you were describing there, and that the commonality of when a hostile state imprisons people it has social control over, and the ingenuity and humanity that overcomes that. There's a lot to learn from each other.
Definitely, yeah, no, absolutely. I think the more one learns about, the more I learn about prison in the U.S. and Israel, kind of in parallel with each other, the more they reverberate off each other in ways that are really powerful. And thinking about prison as a mode of isolating and stigmatizing and separating families and separating friends is really profound. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I couldn't help it. Do you relate to Rana?
Yes, I'm her cousin. Yeah. I said that. I did. yes, I am her first cousin. And I have to say that doing that interview with her was a really great way to focus in on her work, like I said, in really a new way, because you really get to listen in a new way when you're doing that kind of work. And she is really unique in what she does, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.